Welcome to the first session of the course, The History of the American Left at Unregistered Academy. I am Thaddeus Russell, the founder of the Academy and a longtime teacher of American history. In particular, I have focused a lot of my work over the last 30 years of historical research on this, the history of American radical movements on the left in the United States. This course, like all of the courses we offer at Unregistered Academy, is not simply a retelling of a timeline. It is a telling of a timeline. I will be presenting all of the relevant facts, all of the facts that are conveyed in traditional histories of the people and the movements we'll be talking about. But what I will be doing in this course, as we do in every course, is present an argument or a set of arguments about the American left. What I will try to do is identify what I believe are the ideological and cultural lineages of what we see today in what we now call the American left of 2025. And the first, maybe central argument I will make is that the movements that we identify in the 19th century as left wing or radical, or at least as precursors to American left wing radicalism, were all heavily influenced, really, one could say, suffused with Christian evangelicalism and the major activists and intellectuals of American radical movements in the 19th century were almost entirely white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and many were, in fact, Calvinist or Calvinist-inspired Protestants. When we get to the 20th century next week and discuss the socialist and communist movements of the 20th century, as well as the civil rights movement and the Black nationalist, Black radical movement, you will see that the origins, the sources of those movements shift considerably to, not entirely, but I would say predominantly Jewish, immigrant, uh, and urban. Whereas in the 19th century, as I said, those associated with who really were the founders intellectually of the modern American left almost exclusively came from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, largely Calvinist backgrounds, and by the way, mostly in New England. Usually in rural areas, there were some certainly who were from Boston and New York and Philadelphia, but largely they were living on farms. Again, left-wing radicals of the 19th century. They weren't called the left in the 19th century, but we now, virtually every historian who teaches this story, this history, places abolitionism at the origin, at the beginning. So there's no, I'm not making any controversial claim here by placing abolitionism at the beginning of the story of the American left. So, but let's start this. Let's look at the white Anglo-Saxon Christians in the 19th century who founded and led successfully, ultimately, what we call the abolitionist movement. So this painting or drawing here became essentially the unofficial logo of the abolitionist movement, which begins, by the way, in earnest in the 1820s, but really begins to take off and gain large numbers of adherents in the 1830s. The 1830s is where many of the early reform movements begin, and abolitionism was its crown piece. This logo here was found on plates and dishes and towels and various items in abolitionist homes, and I think it speaks quite a bit to the politics, the culture, the ideology of the abolitionist movement. Am I not a man and a brother, says the slave on his knee, looking upward, presumably toward a white man who might liberate him, begging to be released from bondage. And am I not a man and a brother, of course, is a classic Christian statement. Much of the Bible and the New Testament speaks, of course, of a universal equality of man under God. We are all God's children. And, of course, we should be our brother's keeper. So all human beings are equal under God, and each human being has a responsibility to take care of, or when necessary, save his fellow equal men. And of course, in the 1830s and 1840s, for this image to be depicted with that caption was radical because, of course, this was the age of what we now call scientific racism, in which the dominant view among political leaders, intellectuals, scientists, academics, all the major universities was that people of African descent, Negroes, were biologically, eternally, fundamentally different and inferior to whites, people of the white race, which gets redefined in various ways. But as of the mid 20th century, to put forward the idea, just the suggestion that black men, black people could be our brother, white people's brother, meaning our equal, was absolutely radical. This was unquestionably the origin of anti racism in the United States of America. And it was sincere. I will now begin a lengthy critique of the abolitionist movement, but there is no question whatsoever that they were the first and most successful at challenging the ideas of scientific racism. But of course, there's some complications, some interesting paradoxes with their anti racism, which we will now explore. So, this was the masthead, or actually, it's called the flag of the Liberator magazine or newspaper, which was the leading abolitionist publication of this era, began publication in 1831. It was edited by William Lloyd Garrison, the most famous of the radical so-called immediatist abolitionists who called for, as you can imagine from the title, from the name, the immediate abolition of slavery. Other abolitionists, sometimes called gradualists or incrementalists, called for gradual abolition of slavery, reform of slavery with the abolition ultimately in sight. But that was one of the main splits, probably the main split among abolitionists in the 1830s to the 1850s was whether to seek an immediate abolition of slavery or attempt to do so gradually over a longer period. Now this flag of the newspaper of the abolitionists is very interesting, and I hope you're reading what you can here and seeing what you can. But on the left, you have a slave market. It says on the sign, slaves, horses, and other cattle um, in some I'm to suit purchase. It's just it that doesn't matter. It's just the point is that, of course, slaves in the South were being sold, bought and sold like cattle, like oxen, like horses, not like human beings. So again, this is the very, very Christian claim that Negroes, enslaved Negroes, are being treated not like humans, and they should be, because the claim here is that they too are God's children. The on the In the middle, that sort of coin, it says, I come to break the bonds of the oppressor. That is usually interpreted as the words of the man on the right, who is an abolitionist. And of course, that is Jesus Christ in the middle, overseeing this, suggesting that the abolitionists, strongly suggesting that the abolitionists were the elect or the chosen people, people chosen by Christ himself to be the saviors of the oppressed, represented here by the kneeling black slave on the left side. On the right is the picture of emancipation. You can see that sort of gate there. It says the word emancipation over it with American flags on top. And you have a black family with parents and children and grandparents all together, happy, joyfully moving toward the gates of freedom. And then the, I guess it's called the tagline of the newspaper, is in that ribbon that runs through the title there. It says, "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Again, taken directly from the New Testament. Essentially, that's a derivative of the Golden Rule. But Christianity and Christian evangelism suffuses the minds of the early abolitionists. Now, here are the abolitionists' views on black people and slaves, black culture, the ways in which the slaves were living their lives at the time. So I have quotes from three of the leading abolitionists in the 1830s and 1860s here with their views, as I said, on black culture. William Ellery Channing in 1835 said, and this is where, and by the way, these are quotes that you won't find in histories of abolitionism except for a handful. There are, I think, two historians who have mentioned this. Um, most ignore it. Most ignore what I would call the cultural imperialism uh, of the abolitionists, but this is absolutely a major part of the record of this political movement. Channing says in 1835 that the slave should yield himself to intemperance, licentiousness, and in general to sensual excess. We must also expect. Doomed to live for the physical indulgences of others, unused to any pleasures but those of sense. Sorry, I just got a message here. Stripped of self-respect and having nothing to gain in life, how can he be expected to govern himself? What aid does the future give him in withstanding desire? Remember, these are Calvinists, the descendants of the original Puritan pilgrims. That better condition for which other men postpone the cravings of appetite never opens before him. The sense of character, the power of opinion, another restraint on the free, can do little or nothing to rescue so abject a class from excess and debasement. The argument here, made by abolitionists to a man and woman, there's no deviation among them on this, is that slavery made the slaves debased because they have no incentive to work, they have no incentive to become disciplined, they have no incentive to order themselves because they are kept out of wage labor and out of citizenship. They had no reason to adopt the discipline necessary for workers or the discipline necessary for citizens of the United States. And so, because of that, they developed a culture or a lifestyle of debasement, licentiousness, intemperance, and a lot of sex. The problem with slavery is both that it is immoral, that it treats the children of God as animals, which was absolutely a central argument of the abolitionists, but it was also that it made slaves into animals who needed to be civilized. John Jacobus Flournoy in 1835, same year, says, "Without moral observance, except when urged by fear to conform to rules of moral conduct, are apt to disregard chastity." I think they're missing a word. Slaves are apt to disregard chastity, lewd in the last degree, lovers of obscene language and obscene jests, unthinking starers, it's supposed to be starers, at every passing object. Hoggish they are, His bent of genius is vicious, his inclination funny, with starts of mischief, prognostic of greater mischief. If the cowhide does not operate on his fears, their lewdness is extreme and appalling. Remember, these were the leading, really the only spokesmen for black people and slaves in general in the United States at this time. But this was their opinion of the culture of the people they sought to free. Alexander Randall, 1860, says free labor languishes and becomes degrading when put in competition with slave labor and idleness, poverty, and vice. Among large classes of non slaveholders, take the place of industry and thrift and virtue. So, this was their second or twin argument for why slavery should be overthrown. It makes the people under it uncivilized, unchristian, obscene, undisciplined, and disorderly. We ignore this second argument of abolitionists and our histories of them, don't we? But the cultural imperialism there, the cultural arrogance there, and the mission to remake another people's culture is first implanted in the minds of the abolitionists, and it becomes a central tenet, I argue, in all left wing movements in American history to this present day. This is the founding, I say, of the paternalistic cultural imperialism of the American left. And speaking of imperialists, we have the most famous, I think this is true, most famous member, maybe other than Martin Luther King, of the American left. John Brown has been the symbol for virtually every faction of the American radical left I'm aware of since 1861 or 1859. Um, you will see tributes to John Brown on the Democratic Socialists of America website, the Socialist Party website, the Communist Party, the Workers' Party websites. Every BLM, sort of civil rights, black radical organization issues regular tributes to him. He is considered by many, and I am one of them, to be, in many ways, the founder of the modern American left. So let's look at this guy, his life. He was born in Connecticut in a rural town to Calvinist parents who were also abolitionists. So he came to his beliefs honestly. In 1805, his family moved to Ohio, and I went to college in this area, and I know that it's, even to this day, you can still see the remnants of it. Southern Ohio was a hotbed of abolitionism. Lots of abolitionists lived there and did activism out of Southern Ohio because it was near the border. So this is all, not coincidental, right? He went to prep school in Massachusetts and Connecticut, and he was always deeply religious, Calvinist, just like his parents, and wanted to become a minister. He moved as an adult, as a 25-year-old, to New Richmond, Pennsylvania, and he made his home into a stop on the Underground Railroad. Escaped slaves were could stay at his house, and they were given aid and assistance by Brown and his family and his colleagues. So he was a one of the most vigorous activists in the abolitionist movement by far by the time of the 1820s and 1830s. 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia. This was when Nat Turner, a slave, led a rebellion of several dozen slaves, which was extremely violent. They murdered, butchered several white families and children. The rebellion was eventually put down, and Nat Turner was hanged to death. But this was a major inspiration for John Brown and for certain abolitionists who began to call for a violent rebellion or a violent insurrection against the slave power. In 1846, He moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, which at that time was the hub of the abolitionist movement. Many of the leaders of the movement lived and worked out of Springfield. So he's getting more deeply involved in the movement as an activist. The next year, he begins to draw up a plan for a small group of men, of guerrilla soldiers, really, to raid the South, liberate all the slaves, and then escape into the mountains to wage guerrilla war against slavery until it falls. He was never able to garner support from more than 100, I would say 100 people at most nationally were supporting this idea, and even fewer were willing to participate. But he pursued it anyway, being a Calvinist and an abolitionist, with profound passion for his beliefs. In 1855, Brown moved with his sons to the Kansas Territory to join the settlers there who were part of the anti-slavery movement. And at this point, what's important to understand is in the mid 1850s, Kansas was a territory whose status as to slavery or not was unknown, was to be determined by a popular referendum. Congress gave the people of Kansas the right to determine whether it would be a slave state or a free state. And at that point, there was equilibrium between slave states and free states in the Congress. And so they neither faction held a controlling position in Congress. So this became politically explosive, right? If Kansas gets two, if Kansas becomes a slave state, that means there will be two new pro-slavery senators in the Congress, which would move the balance of power to the slave states. And this was a cause of tremendous alarm and even panic among many people in the North, not because they were concerned terribly about the plight of slaves. Most Americans, the vast majority of white Americans in the North, cared little. They were not like John Brown. He was highly unusual, cared not at all, really, about the condition of slaves. But they did not want slave owners, large plantation slave owners, to move to the North to establish massive plantations with armies of unfree labor, thereby competing with and defeating the yeoman independent farmers of the North. That, by the way, is the origin of the Civil War, according to most intelligent historians. The anti-slavery movement is different than the abolitionist movement. When we talk about the anti-slavery movement, it is really a movement that is, again, not concerned with black people or the slaves, but concerned with what they called the slave power taking control of the country and converting all of America into a plantation economy. That was the reason, and we know this from diaries and letters and lots of testimonials. That is the reason why so many soldiers, although there was still a draft, but the ones who did volunteered to fight for the Union Army against the South because they were primarily concerned about the encroaching slave power. Okay, so Kansas became the literal battleground to determine this. And so what happened was many anti-slavery activists, abolitionists, and just settlers moved to Kansas to make sure to populate that territory with anti-slavery people so that it would become a free state. But simultaneously, pro-slavery people moved into Kansas as well. And of course, fighting ensued, quite bloody fighting. There were multiple murders. I think it was 50 to 60 people were murdered in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. About a 5-year conflict from 1854 to 1859. And Brown and his sons moved right into the middle of the fray. They moved to Kansas and began to organize with the anti-slavery settlers attacks against the pro-slavery forces. So in May 21st, 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the free soil or anti-slavery town of Lawrence in Kansas and killed, I think, several people. And Brown's sons, or one or two of his sons, lived in or near Lawrence, Kansas. And so, in response, Brown led a nighttime raid on pro-slavery settlers along Pottawatomie Creek. This was Brown and his sons and some of their associates riding on horseback with torches and guns at night to the houses, the homes of pro-slave to several pro-slavery settlers on the creek. They ordered the men out of the homes, uh, and in front of their families, shot them and then hacked them to pieces, dismembering them with swords. So this is widely considered to have been the first act of terrorism, political terrorism committed in the United States. The only question is whether that terrorism is now celebrated as an act of liberation, or whether it is simply seen as an act of political terror and the precursor to a long lineage, 200 years, of left wing violence, because violence has been a central part of this history we're telling. Many people say that the ethos of the modern left was born, forged with John Brown and his attitude of Christian righteousness. Here's a depiction of Bleeding Kansas. It was a very nasty fight for about 5 years, as I said. Eventually, Kansas did become a free state and was admitted to the Union as a free state. But all of this was a major provocation that led to the Civil War. In 1857 and 58, Brown traveled throughout the North and Canada trying to raise funds for his big idea, his next mission, which was to launch an armed insurrection in the South, a plan he had been working on previously. In 1858, in May, he held a secret convention in Chatham, Ontario, to adopt a provisional constitution for a new free republic within the United States. So here is the first inkling of a an empire within an empire. The radical abolitionists, the immediatists like John Brown, had this kind of idea or these kinds of ideas about what to do with the South, and this was predominant. That they would establish a whole new free republic there, a whole new country, in effect, a whole new nation state with different laws, a new constitution, etc., that they themselves, of course, would write. So it was the first sort of clearly delineated idea to conquer another land and remake its people and its culture. Came from the abolitionists, the origins of the modern American left. In 1859, October 16th, Brown and 21 of his followers seized the federal armory during what's called the Raid on Harper's Ferry. Everyone here has heard about it. It's in every textbook. They were hoping and intending to inspire the slaves in Virginia to rise up in a rebellion and overthrow their masters. Of course, not a single slave did do that. And instead, local militia, many townspeople in Harper's Ferry, and U.S. Marines surrounded the armory, killed 10 of Brown's men, including two of his sons. And Brown was captured. He was wounded and taken prisoner. He was tried for treason, murder, and inciting slave insurrection. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death and was hanged to death on December 2nd, 1859 in Charlestown, Virginia. And look at what John Brown said as he was being marched to the gallows. He said, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Calvinism teaches, American Calvinism, I should say, the particular brand of Calvinism, teaches or taught about the inherent depravity and sinfulness of man. All of us are sinners. It also, American Calvinism holds within it, and again, this is dating from the Puritan pilgrims of the 17th century, carried through this idea that they were the elect, God's elect, as I mentioned earlier, those chosen by God to save the sinners. We are the elect. And also, finally, there was a belief that increasingly among sort of the abolitionist wing of Calvinism in New England in the 19th century, that slavery, the existence of slavery, was simply evidence of the profound depravity and sinfulness of the nation as a whole. So the United States, all Americans were sinners in this. We're all equally responsible for allowing this abomination against God to exist. But to me, the self-anointment as the elect, as the saviors, is crucial because you see that as well throughout the history of the American left, and certainly I would say you see it today in the modern incarnation of American left-wing politics. Now, let me just check the chat here. Yes and yes. Okay, good. So then, of course, the Civil War commences, spurred in large part by John Brown's raid, which caused, panic in the South and also inspired many people in the North to take up the fight. But after the Civil War, Charles Sumner, senator and one of the most powerful and famous and important politicians in America at the time, radical Republican. By the way, the radical Republicans of that time were really the original progressives. In many ways, that was they were the founders of the modern progressive movement. Abolitionists, uh, hawks, absolute hawks during the Civil War, called for the complete annihilation of Southern life, Southern culture, and a remaking of the South entirely, the remaking of the psychology and the culture of the people who lived there, including the slaves. Considered the 600 or so thousand men who died during the Civil War, and you can see many of them lying on the field at Gettysburg there in the bottom right, was well worth it to redeem the nation. And that's the kind of language they used. Again, Sumner, like many of the radical Republicans, hailed from New England, or at least the Northeast. All or almost all had Protestant, Christian, some Calvinist backgrounds. And they had a very particular view of the Declaration of Independence. Here is Charles Sumner's interpretation in the wake of the Civil War of the meaning of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. He says no local claim of self-government can for a moment interfere with the supremacy of the nation. So he's a great centralizer here, you can see. In the maintenance of human rights, each locality has its own way in all matters peculiar to itself. But the rights of all must be placed under the protection of all. Nor can there be any difference in different parts of the country. Here the rule must be uniform, and it must be sustained by the central power radiating to every part of the various empire. This is according to the divine cosmos, which in all its spaces is pervaded by one universal law. It is the rule of almighty beneficence, which, while leaving human beings to the activities of daily life and the consciousness of free will, subjects all to the same commanding principles. Such centralization is the highest civilization, for it approaches the nearest to the heavenly example. Call it imperialism if you please. It is simply the imperialism of the Declaration of Independence with all its promises fulfilled. Already by central power, slavery has been abolished. Already by central power, all have been assured in the equality of civil rights. Oops. The Declaration of Independence, therefore, is being read by the leaders of the Civil War, by abolitionists, by the founders of modern progressivism and the modern left. It's being read not as a list of rights, but as a list of duties to overthrow tyrannical leaders, such as the slave masters, such as the kings of Europe, such as the pashas of the Mediterranean, two of whom Thomas Jefferson did overthrow immediately after taking office as president in 1802. But this is a stunning interpretation of the Declaration of Independence, although I do think it has a lot of integrity. I think Jefferson himself intended it this way. But most people, certainly, have not read it that way. They've read it simply as a list of rights, rights against kings, against monarchs, against tyrants, the right of the people to resist, to rebel. This is the duty now. It is being read as the duty, the obligation to fight and overthrow the tyrants wherever they may be. One of the crowning projects of the abolitionists, I mean, it really was the crowning project of the abolitionists, was after the Civil War with the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau across the South. And they built roads, they built libraries, hospitals, um, and they built about 4,000 schools all over the South for the freedmen, the ex-slaves, to be educated in. This is a picture of a Freedmen's Bureau school, and on the right is a portrait of Oliver Otis Howard, a Union general who was the director, head of the Freedmen's Bureau. And what they did in these schools, and these were staffed almost entirely by abolitionists, teachers, usually women, young women from New England, who taught the ex-slaves reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also how to dress like white Americans, how to speak like white Americans, how to work like white Americans, how to stay in nuclear families like white Americans, how to avoid drinking and cigars and fornication and leisure and laziness like the imagined white American. It was an assimilationist project through and through, an attempt to remake the very minds and behaviors of the Negroes who were the ex-slaves. It was full-blown imperialism in a conquered land. Of course, the Union Army, which was then the United States Army, occupied the South, there were military outposts all across the South, enforcing what's called Reconstruction, making sure that these schools continued teaching the people of the South, in particular the black people of the South, how to be like Northerners, in particular Northern abolitionists. So this is, again, very, as you will see, clearly proto left wing in terms of what radical movements do after this, in terms of attempting to remake the lives and the very minds of the dispossessed, the oppressed, the poor, etc. Cultural imperialism was a hallmark of the American left from the very beginning. Okay, now I'm gonna just pause for a second because I need to switch. Okay, so now we are gonna move from abolitionism and Reconstruction to the advent of what is called the American Progressive Movement or progressivism. Let's look at what is called the progressive era. What were the major sort of historical transformations, changes happening between the 1880s and the 1920s, which is what's usually called the progressive era? So during this time, this is, right out, Reconstruction ends in 1877. The Union Army moves from the South. They stop occupying the South. The so-called Redeemers, many of them are sort of ex-Confederates, reestablish control over the state legislatures across the South in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, 1890s. But during that time in the North, in the cities in particular, vast transformations are taking place. Number one, this is the era of what's been called the Great Migration or Great Immigration, largely from Europe and largely at this time from Central or Southern and Eastern Europe and Central Europe and rural America too, by the way. It wasn't just Europeans coming to the United States. It was also a lot of rural people during this period moving into the cities. In particular, many black people. The Great Migration of African Americans takes place during this time, and this is when you see millions of African Americans moving from the country in the South into large cities across the United States. This is when Chicago, South Chicago became black. This is when Harlem became black. This is when parts of Philadelphia became black, etc. So massive demographic shifts happening during this period. The populations of major cities in this 40-year period doubled each decade during this period. So that's how radical the changes are. And just think for a second about living in a city, living in one of those cities during that time, right? I mean, all these people from different countries, each with their own culture. None of them are assimilated, at least at first, when they first get here. So they're speaking their native languages and exhibiting their native cultures and religions, and they're largely on the streets because they're poor. Um, so that's who the progressives were. They were people who were already living in the cities. These again were overwhelmingly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the progressives, living in the big cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, who'd been there for generations, right? WASPs were the dominant majority in America until that point. And they're seeing within just the course of a few years everything change in their cities being filled with all of these strangers from strange lands. Political machines emerged in the cities, the major cities in America during this period. Many of these were immigrant so-called machines, although Kansas City was WASP, but in the East Coast cities, immigrants sort of banded together, established clubs or organizations that took over city government. The Tammany machine in New York is the most famous, but most cities during this period had what we call a machine, meaning it was not accountable, it was not democratic. It was a system of patronage. Uh, the city bosses, they were called, elected mayors, but they would essentially sell votes by giving out services and sometimes even money, jobs, or fixing the sewage in someone's neighborhood in exchange for their votes or the votes of an entire block or the votes of an entire neighborhood. And that's how they won election. This was seen as corrupt, and many of the original progressives spent most of their time and energy attacking the political machines. Again, mostly these were immigrant political powers within the cities that had taken over. So again, if you're a multi-generation WASP living in New York City in 1890, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing your entire city, your entire world, right, revolutionize and be taken over by these people from Italy and Ireland and Greece and Russia. By 1900 in New York City and Chicago, 4 out of every 5 residents were either immigrants or the children or immigrants. What a statistic. Talk about a transformation. As I said, most of the immigration during this period was from Southern and Eastern Europe. So you had a lot of Slavs, a lot of Jews, a lot of Italians, each with their own distinct culture that was radically different than dominant American culture. There was tremendous corruption, or at least perceived corruption, during this period. Business owners were bribing politicians, giving out money to politicians to get streetcar franchises or favorable incorporation laws or protective tariffs on the national or international level. Tremendous class warfare during this time, massive industrial strikes featuring thousands of workers, much violence, violence between strikers and strike breakers, the replacement workers brought in by the owners of these factories, one of which is pictured in the background there. So you had tremendous violence every year during this period, especially in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Youngstown, the big industrial centers with all the factories, and then all the immigrant workers moving into those cities into those places to take those jobs. So you had these towns, which are still to this day, many of these street cities, like in Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio, are still largely, Polish or Czechoslovakian or something, right? Some Eastern European or Southern European demographic. But there was just chaos with all of this, right? People saw chaos, violence, fighting in the streets. There was widespread what was perceived to be corporate negligence. This was highlighted or publicized in a number of novels. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which all of us were forced to read in high school, did this the most effectively, showing that many of these factories, especially making food, were disgusting and unhygienic and not at all safe for the workers who worked at them. And this was true. I mean, workers commonly lost limbs, were blinded, lost fingers and hands and feet, and died in large numbers in these brand new factories that were all part of the Industrial Revolution. So, again, just general sense of unease, even panic about the mass transformations going on in American life at the time. Also, and this is a mass transformation that caused a lot of panic, women were moving into industrial work. The vast majority of American women before 1880 lived on farms. By 1920, a majority of American women lived in large cities. That is a radical change with all sorts of attendant consequences, which you can just imagine. One of the consequences of women moving into the cities was the rise of popular entertainment and consumer capitalism. Women still are, but especially then, were the primary consumers of entertainment and the new consumer goods that were being produced for the first time. So we had movies. Hollywood is just beginning, but the pre-Hollywood theaters are producing movies that are being shown in Nickelodeons and little movie theaters in New York and Boston and Philadelphia, Chicago. Dime novels become the primary, the number one most popular form of entertainment, especially among women. These were just sort of like pulp serial novels featuring, young women overcoming tremendous obstacles to find the man who's the prince, who's wealthy, and they live happily ever after with lots of adventure along the way. But they were hugely popular, and considered to be debased, déclassé by many elites, and almost all progressives hated all of this stuff. Department stores emerge at this time for the first time, Macy's, Wanamaker's, and others. For the very first time, poor and working class Americans can afford to buy things that were made outside of their town or village. Like affordable fashion clothes that were made in New York or even in Paris were suddenly, for the first time, affordable to working class people who could buy them in these brand new department stores. And the fashion was being shown in the movies and being discussed in the dime novels. So it was a large culture of consumer capitalism and entertainment bursting out at this time. All of which was a cause for concern, not celebration, among the people we call progressives. Okay, we got to get through this list. A lot of legislation. Don't want to get too bogged down in this. there's not any reason to, you don't need to memorize all of this, but you certainly need to get a sense of the general thrust of the legislative response of the progressives during this time. What did they do in terms of enacting law? They enacted a lot of laws. So this is really the American economy was almost entirely unregulated before this period. In this 40-year period, you see just a raft of legislation to regulate the economy and politics. So this is really the beginning of the regulatory state, the welfare state that we all know and love. The most famous progressives were known as muckrakers. These were journalists who wrote exposés of corporate corruption or political corruption or monopolies or unhealthy, unsafe work environments. So Lincoln Steffens, these are the most famous. Lincoln Steffens wrote books and articles on municipal city corruption. Ida Tarbell on the oil trust, the big monopolies in the oil industry. And Upton Sinclair, as I mentioned earlier, on the meat trust, especially with his novel, The Jungle. Now, in terms of legislation, so we've got the Pendleton Act of 1883, one of the first pieces of progressive legislation. This mandated that 10% of all federal offices be filled by written exam instead of by patronage, right? So as to eliminate the corruption that was happening in national politics. The 17th Amendment, ratified in 1913, mandated the direct election of senators from the states instead of by the state legislatures, again, making them more democratic and accountable, at least theoretically, and taking it out of the power to select senators out of the hands of politicians locally. The initiative, referendum, and recall uh, were established in many states, not at the federal level, but at the state level in many states, in particular in the West. Again, giving more direct power to the Democratic voter and taking power away from the already seated political leaders who were widely considered to be corrupt. Women's suffrage was part of the anti corruption effort. This, of course, was the 19th Amendment, which went into effect in 1920. The idea, and we'll see the argument made for this, was that women were uniquely qualified and able to enact domestic reform because they were historically devoted to reform in the home on a daily basis as housewives, what was called helpmeets. So the idea, the argument, and we'll see this in a minute laid out, was that because women had been historically tasked with keeping order in the home, they would be better suited to maintaining order in the broader society. That's why we need to give them the vote and allow them to run for office. So a feminization of American politics was first imagined around this time positively. The idea was we could not reform ourselves and make America into a humane society without women acting as political and legislative actors. Many municipalities, cities, and towns across the country, including the one I was born and raised in, Berkeley, California, Madison. A lot of college towns did this. They adopted what was called the city manager model. This is still the case, by the way. Berkeley still has a city manager, which basically runs the city. They're unelected, which is sort of a contradiction with their, move to take corruption out of politics. But the idea was the city manager would be above corruption because he would be an engineer or a scientist, not someone trained in politics, but trained in the sciences and the social sciences, who would simply bring scientific, rationalistic thinking in totally to their job in running a city. And that's true. Many of them have been like social engineers, public engineers, right? Or just social scientists who run the city as bureaucrats or technocrats. That's a progress. It's still many cities in America still have that model. That is from the progressives. Anti-monopoly was a major plank of the progressive platform. I'm looking at the chat real quick. Yep, big in California. Yep. Um, Why does that happen? Sorry. So, anti-monopolies. Sherman Antitrust Act was the most famous, 1890. It outlawed, quote, restraint of trade and attempts to monopolize. Of course, those were to be determined by Congress, which could act accordingly. The Sherman Antitrust Act has actually been enacted very seldom, but it did establish a very important precedent. In 1911, Standard Oil was broken up, one of the big monopolies of the time. The Clayton Act of 1914 outlawed various, quote, unfair business practices. Again, unfair being left to Congress to determine. Gabriel Kolko was a Marxist historian, a great Marxist historian who wrote several books arguing with um, quite a bit of persuasiveness that the anti-monopoly regulation of the progressive era actually accelerated monopolization by creating what we now call regulatory capture in various industries. That's sort of a side note. If you're interested in that, I strongly recommend Gabriel Kolko's books, in particular his book on the railroads. I forget the exact title, but you can see Gabriel Kolko, Railroads Regulation, I think it's called. Highly recommended, great historical work, and a Marxist arguing essentially a free market, making essentially a free market argument against state regulation of monopolies. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913, a favorite among, I'm sure, many people watching this course or part of this course. It made there are 12 Federal Reserve banks, this is still the case, jointly responsible for managing the money supply. These are banks that are privately owned, but are tasked with the responsibility of managing the money supply, an immense power that has been hotly contested ever since. So these are the major, I would say, federal and state level and municipal level laws that were enacted during the progressive era by progressives. Then we have more uh, business regulation. There was the 1902 anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania. Theodore Roosevelt, the president, ordered arbitration by an expert in industrial relations. This is part of the rise of the expert that got called into question in 2020 and 2021. The federal government and local government, state governments started to call for and actually require people who were trained in professional schools to take positions like this, like in arbitrating industrial relations or in managing cities, etc. The rise of the expert class was a major part of the progressive era. Meat Inspection Act of 1906. This is following Upton Sinclair in his expose of the disgusting meat industry. So the federal government now made it its right to inspect inside factories and workplaces. All of this was happening with the rise of professional associations and licensing, right? So the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Historical Association, all these associations, there's hundreds and hundreds of them. They were established during this time. These were all sort of progressive projects to keep the riffraff and the rabble out of particular socially valuable occupations. And then state and local licensing, right? So to become a barber, you had to get a license all of a sudden. To be a bartender, of course, you had to get a license, on and on and on. That is all part of the progressive era. Social welfare. Also, there were laws at the state and local level. I don't think there was a federal one, but many on the state and local level that limited the work day and the work week for the first time. These are the first work hours laws in American history. They were enacted during this time. Of course, most people who worked in the factories during the Industrial Revolution worked 12 to 14 to sometimes 16 hours a day and often 50, 60, or 70 hours per week. That began to change for various reasons, but the laws formalizing that were first enacted during the progressive era of the 1880s and early 1900s. There was also a special kind of work law called protective legislation. Again, this is in various states and cities, which limited work hours just for women because it was commonly believed that women were physically unable to work as long or as hard as men. Feminists at the time, the suffragists and feminists of the time, debated this. Many welcomed it because they wanted women to get out of the home and into the workplace, and they saw this as one way of facilitating that. But others saw it as obviously sexist and essentialist, and underlining or reinforcing the idea, the assumption that women needed particular protections, when the feminist movement, in large part, was arguing that women are and should be treated as equals to men. So it's an interesting contradiction. But nonetheless, the idea of the government governing the workplace was new and progressive. Laws against child labor also were enacted during this period, with the big federal anti-child labor law being passed in 1938, but that goes across the states, through the cities, all during the progressive era, a major part of the progressive campaign. Factory safety laws of various kinds were also enacted. And then there was moral regulation. We have prohibition, a major progressive project. Virtually every progressive was for prohibition. Progressives led the movement for prohibition, which culminated in the 18th Amendment, of course, which was enacted in 1919, and then the Volstead Act, which enforced the prohibition, which became effective in January of 1920. And then eugenics, again, another progressive project, the idea of identifying inferior genes among certain demographic groups, which, by the way, were often white, but just mostly working class and poor people, identifying them as being genetically recessive, regressive, and then enacting measures or law to stop them from procreating, and also to encourage those with alleged superior genes to have children. So all of that goes under the title of eugenics. Uh, this was entirely a progressive project. The scientists, so-called scientists and doctors who led the eugenics campaign or movement in the first half of the 20th century were almost to a man or woman progressive. They then, in the 1930s, took their ideas to Germany and sold Adolf Hitler and the Nazis on the idea of eugenics. And of course, the Nazis took eugenics and ran with it, but that has an American and progressive origin. Progressives, and we'll see this in a moment. We will look at their ideas, I promise, just in a second, but they were extremely concerned about the rise of gambling and amusement parks, dance halls, movies, prostitution, venereal disease, and homosexuality, all of which are taking off during this time. And so progressives established vice commissions in cities across the country to regulate and shut down these illicit activities. Okay. Settlement houses, last list, I promise. The settlement houses were reformatories, reform homes or houses for immigrants in which they were given assistance and aid, places to stay, essentially, sometimes, but mostly education and training. These were in cities, every city in the country had settlement houses by 1910, 1920. They were all run by progressives as a progressive project. The most famous and important one was Hull House in Chicago. You may have heard of it even. It's in every American history textbook. It was run by Jane Addams. It was established in 1889. And by 1915, there were 400 settlement houses across the United States. As I said, every major city had multiple settlement houses by that time, administering to the immigrant population. They ran kindergartens in settlement houses. They gave adult education classes, health programs, employment bureaus, job listings, which was a very popular thing for immigrants, of course, and then a whole lot of moral instruction for women, men, and children. And the moral instruction was essentially identical to the moral instruction given to the ex-slaves in the Freedmen's Bureau. Dress right, act right, work hard, be disciplined, obey the law, obey your authorities, get married, be in a family, be in a nuclear family, serve in the military, etc. Here's what progressives thought about the new popular culture that was rising all around them in the cities at the turn of the 20th century that we've talked about so far. This is Rita Childore, major progressive and suffragist reformer in New York City. She said, "The dance hall, as we have permitted it to exist, practically unregulated, has become a veritable forcing house of vice and crime in every city in the United States." Just checking the chat here. Good stuff. Vaught, this is Robert Woods, who was the head of the Settlement House Association. Vaudeville theater appeals to a morbid love of the abnormal and features inane chaff and the grossest vulgarity. John Dewey, the great philosopher, we're going to look at him in detail in a moment. Great philosopher at Columbia University, was considered to be probably the most famous progressive intellectual at the time. Said adverse opinions as to the possibility of a general democratic culture are also based on the low standards intellectually and aesthetically of the radio, the movie, and the popular theater. The moving pictures, the jazz music, the comic strip are not an object of pride to those who have learned to know good art, good music, and good literature. So a complete cultural elitism, identical to that of the abolitionists and the leaders of the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction. This, again, I submit, has been a hallmark of the American left since its origins. Jane Addams's Hull House specifically banned what they called vulgar, vapid, and morally offensive dramas and spectacles, including vaudeville and minstrel shows and ragtime and the great classical American jazz music was banned from immigrant spaces in the settlement houses. So again, carrying forward the Puritan tradition that we looked at earlier that suffused the abolitionist movement. You see it here as well with the progressives. I call it now because the progressives aren't speaking in explicitly Christian terms, as you can see, unlike the abolitionists. I'm calling it the secularization of American Christianity. And it shows up or it appears, I'm arguing, in this particular political lineage, in the lineage of what we call the left.